Good evening and welcome. It's really wonderful of you all to turn out on this first evening of the return to the school term at Columbia, or in any event, a Monday evening in New York when there's so many other things that are possible. We're really thrilled that you're here. We're thrilled to have been able to put together this panel. This panel is really the object of just a lot of it's a culmination of a long process and a lot of caring engagement of different people. I'm Peter Rosenblum, and I was until last year here at Columbia Law School running the Human Rights Clinic. And as part of that process over the last few years, we launched research into tea plantations and tea labor in India. And over the course of 2 years here, and many trips to India with numbers of students, we did pretty massive research into one particular company and its involvement in an effort, an exploration of social responsibility and tea. And that's one of the things we'll hear about. That's the culmination of that was this report, which is also outside, The Northland's Change, the World Bank Tata, Enduring Abuses on India's Tea Plantations. One of the other authors, Sarah Sadoun, is a third-year law student who's here with us tonight. In the course of the work that we did over the years of work in tea in India, we engaged with varieties of movement actors and activists and researchers who made our work possible. One of the first people that we met in the field who really helped us to understand how to cross the line between management and workers on an Indian tea plantation is Sarah Besky, who's currently an anthropologist based at the University of Michigan, and whose book, The Darjeeling Distinction, Labor and Justice on Fairtrade Tea Plantations in India, has recently come out. And she's joined us from the University of Michigan to be here to talk a bit about her work on fair trade tea, but also talk about the work now that she's going to be leading into on the auctions and the tea sector more generally. Ashwini Sutankar, who's sitting to my left, has been involved in this work with me and with Columbia from the very beginning. She's an international labor rights lawyer currently working for the Union Unite Here in International Affairs. But when she initially took this work on, it was as an independent consultant, working first to look at fair trade and the tea sector in India, and then to consult and advise with us on the Columbia Law Project on Tata and the conditions on those plantations. Max Barrick, who's sitting to Ashwini's left, has been a correspondent with the New York Times, lives and works in India, and without any connection to us, had already done research on tea plantations in Assam, and very kindly integrated a bit of our work or reference into his article in the New York Times on tea plantations in Assam. He'll be talking a bit about the plantations, the background in Assam, and hopefully sharing more of his personal experience of what led to the article that appeared in the New York Times. And then finally, Phyllis Robinson is with Equal Exchange. In the course, we won't, any of you who have engaged with questions of social responsibility, fair trade, the various ways of trying to engage as a consumer in markets to promote the rights of workers should be aware of Equal Exchange. Perhaps you are. They've really been a leader in the movement. One that and leader is very important. They've not always followed the big label fair trade and the directions that the fair trade industry has gone in recent times, and they're always coming up with creative, innovative ideas and ways for engaging for a real fairness in trade in commodities. So we're going to start with Ashwini, and then move down the line. Each will talk for about 10 minutes, and then we'll have a lot of questions, I hope.
So I'd like to start with the mainstream fair trade that Peter talked about, because that was what first got us engaged in tea. We were approached by the major licensor of Fairtrade, the Fairtrade labeling organization, to see if we would do a study that looked at the hired labor standards. And for those of you who are newcomers to the fair trade system, the term hired labor standards it's really like a third rail, because fair trade was founded on the idea of cooperatives. And so expanding from cooperatives to situations where you had employers and employees was very, very contentious. And so, in retrospect, I think what they wanted from us was a puff piece, which was to show that the hired labor standards work, that it works to bring the model of fair trade to connect it with plantations rather than cooperatives. Coming from my own perspective, I also desperately wanted it to work. I come from an international labor rights perspective. I believe in the idea of workers and workers having power. And I was deeply skeptical about the development community's turn to the small as a solution for everything. And so I thought, it would be great if what they're proposing for tea plantations actually works. We got to India, to the plantations that they wanted us to focus on, and found that fair trade was just a superficial overlay on an extremely dysfunctional system. And maybe it makes sense to step back for a moment and just talk about what an Indian tea plantation is. Indian tea plantations probably have not changed for 150 years. For most of the context that we were looking at, the workers were the descendants of indentured labor who'd been brought there 150 years ago. It's an extremely paternalistic system where the employer provides everything: housing, food, medical care, and that's not quite paradise. It's more like slavery. And in fact, on one fair trade plantation, a manager said to us, we give them everything. We give those workers everything. Why do they, we give them a house, we give them food, we give them, the state gives them a TV set. They don't need wages. So this was the context that we were looking at, and the history has very, very real consequences. So just to give you one example, fair trade on paper requires that all workers be paid a living wage. In the plantation context, where in India, where wages are set through so-called tripartite bargaining between the employers who are an extremely strong and united lobby, between the government, which is very much on the side of employers, and the unions who have long been broken or corrupted by the employers' lobby. The wages are extremely low, but there's no way that anyone could pay a wage above that, because it would constitute an unfair labor practice. It would that literally employers are not allowed to pay more than what is set through this extremely corrupt negotiation system. So at the end of this research, when things had fallen apart in our relationship with fair trade, I ended up getting pulled into an investigation called by the International Union of Food Workers, which is a kind of a global body bringing together unions in the food and agriculture sector. And there'd been the death of a spray worker at an estate in the northeast of India, and they asked if I'd be a part of the team that went to talk to the workers and figure out what was going on. How it could be that on such an estate, workers have been working without protective gear, and how could one have just dropped dead. I'll spare you the story of what happened when we got there. it wasn't pretty. But what we did find was that this estate, Poway, was one of 24 that had been owned until very recently by a giant conglomerate called Tata. That's not a yes. So Tata is the company we ended up focusing on. Tata is probably the biggest multinational you never heard of. They own everything from Jaguar, the Pierre Hotel at the southeast corner of Central Park, Core Steel, Land Rover, many things. They're in many sectors. And until 2007, their tea plantations were totally vertically integrated. So that means they did everything from growing the tea to selling the bags at the end. And then what happened in tea was something that we've already seen and written about a great deal in many other sectors. So, for example, we know that now in garments, no brand owns its own factories, right? I mean, Nike just contracts for production all over the world, as does the Gap and every other major brand. It happens in the service sector. No corporation runs its own cafeteria anymore. I don't think Colombia runs its own cafeteria anymore. So in agriculture, you see the same thing. Tata decided that the money to be made was in branding and retail and not in the growing of tea. So they started getting rid of their plantations, but there was one major barrier, which is in a sector that is as paternalistic as the tea sector. It looks really bad when you get rid of plantations because you're basically you're portrayed in the media as getting rid of your children. Unilever, the other big competitor with Tata in the tea sector, had tried to do exactly the same thing a few years before. They sold their plantations and they were basically pilloried in the media by government. So Tata knew that they couldn't do the same thing. So what they did was they turned to the International Finance Corporation, which is the private lending arm of the World Bank. And the minor piece of what they got through that relationship was a $7.8 million loan. The bigger piece that they got was that they were able to close what they did next as a development project. So they didn't just sell off their plantations to the highest bidder. They got their workers to buy the plantations from them. This was enabled both through the IFC loan as well as a loan from a state-owned bank in India. Each worker, or about 2/3 of the workers who were either bullied, coerced, or deceived into participating in the scheme, took out a loan of about $150, the equivalent of $150 to be paid back over 7 years. And if you think that doesn't sound like a lot of money, you don't know what wages are like on tea plantations. Along with the loan, Tata put in place an economic diversification scheme. So where tea plantations are really like looking on a massive monoculture scheme, every direction you look, it's just tea bushes. Tata said, we're going to change this in the interest of the environment, in the interest of creating new and better jobs. We're going to bring in new types of economic opportunity. We're going to set up fisheries. We're going to grow black pepper. In some places, they said we're going to grow flowers and vegetables. So the development and social rhetoric sounded really great on paper, and it really built on Tata's reputation within India and to some extent internationally as a storied corporate house. How am I doing for time? Should I?
3 minutes.
I have 3 minutes left. Okay, so I'll spend a second then going through the rest. So what's unfortunate is that Tata was actually like every other employer. if you go onto a Tata plantation, it's not that it's worse than other tea plantations. It's exactly the same. What that means is you have collapsing houses for workers, you have barely functional schools, you have latrines that haven't been cleaned in 10 years, and the diseases of poverty are endemic. Cholera, infant mortality rates are higher, are a factor of 10 higher than in the surrounding areas. So basically, it's kind of like going on to a failing state within a state, because the plantations operate as their own government. The Indian government really doesn't intervene to monitor or to enforce the law that exists on the books. And the new mechanisms, the mechanisms that were supposedly put in place by the World Bank or by the social responsibility bodies that Tata had contracted with, had really changed nothing. Given the extreme congealment that exists on Indian tea plantations, I mean, it's 150 years of history. It's not clear that they could have changed much in a kind of piecemeal way, even if they tried. Our conclusion at the end was that piecemeal efforts won't be able to make any change on tea plantations. You really will have to have sector-wide transformation to make anything better. Unfortunately, in some key ways, they've made things worse. So the workers' share plan, as we said, was pushed through on workers with a mix of deceit and coercion, and it left them substantially indebted. Basically, the payments over the next 7 years will mean about a 10% deduction from their take-home wages week by week. The economic diversification that the World Bank was so proud of, unfortunately, has taken away one of the very few benefits that the workers did have from the colonial era, which was access to land. There isn't a lot of land easily available on tea plantations, so in order to set up a fishery, basically Tata had to take away the land that workers had relied on to grow rice and vegetables. Yes? Okay. I will stop more or less mid-thought, but I think that's as good as anything.
You can go on a little bit longer. I'll probably take less than 10 minutes. Sure. So what I wanted to do is a little bit self-indulgent, but I wanted to tell the story of the tea plantation worker in a little bit more thorough of a way than I was able to in 1,000 or 1,100 words in the New York Times. And I think it will provide maybe a bit of color in your minds about what these places look like and how they function. And I wanted to start first with kind of a generalized history of tea plantations in Assam, which are the plantations that produce 1/6 of the world's tea, although most of that tea that's grown there is drank in India, which is also the world's largest tea consumer. And unfortunately, this issue does not get much attention in the Indian media, and it's only just beginning to get attention here. So in my mind, the history starts with the British colonial government penetrating different parts of India, and in some places finding groups that reacted more violently to their subjugation. And one of those places in which they encountered that reaction was in Northeast India. And as was British policy more or less all over the world, whether that was Guyana or Northeast India, they imported labor to make up for the fact that local populations were unwilling to work on big plantations, whether that was tea in parts of India or sugar cane in other places. And so millions of so-called tribal people, Adivasi people in India were brought to what's now Assam And over the past more than a century since that happened, they have not only not been accepted as locals by the indigenous communities that live in the Northeast, but they've been forgotten and essentially uncounted by the Indian government in many ways as well. When you hear that 8% of India's population is tribal, so to speak, that does not count the 7 million or so tea plantation workers, more than 90% of whom are also of tribal descent from places that do have tribals that are counted. And that is, is astonishing to me in a way, because they pick the tea and are the key to the functioning of the tea industry in a country where people drink 2 or 3 or 7 or 10 cups of tea in a day. Only very, very recently, to my knowledge, I suppose I'm no authority on this, the first reports like these and first court cases are taking place now, thanks to a group of advocacy groups on the ground that I'll get to later, who are very important, I think, in having brought us all here and having given us access. But these court cases do revolve around what Ashwini was talking about, which is primarily the Plantations Labor Act, which in my mind is in many ways an enforcement of feudal structure that dates to pre-independence India. And I won't go into the specifics because she mentioned so many of them, but if you get the chance and get the access to walk around on a tea plantation, you will find schools where there are 250 students to one teacher. You'll find clinics that are reusing syringes and that have painkillers and antibiotics and the nurses prescribe those for all illnesses. And you also, and those things contribute to what is not just your run-of-the-mill poverty. The majority of people who I spoke to, I tried to make a point of asking them what they ate every day, and almost 9 out of 10 people who I talked to said that we eat rice sprinkled with salt, which I don't think is normal even in other very poor parts of India, or in other very poor and tribal parts of India. So the key to my access to these plantations was a group called Padra, which is one of a number of advocacy groups that is of the tea plantations, in the sense that there are a small few of tea plantation workers who are able to leave the plantations, and some of them have become activists for the cause of their fellow workers. The main guy at Padra who I was traveling with, his parents were tea plantation workers. Many of his family members were tea plantation workers. And they provided kind of crucial access and also crucial oversight to what happens on these tea plantations. And what they showed me was eventually categorically denied by Tata and the subsidiary company that they created that Ashwini was talking about, which is Amalgamated Plantations Private Limited. After my story, they tried all that they could to suppress it and ask for corrections, even when there were no factual inaccuracies. So there is quite the, there is a sense definitely that that they're being called out for things that they either thought might fly under the radar, or that they have plausible deniability for, which I don't believe is necessarily true. But part of that plausible deniability, maybe before these reports, was certainly based on certification processes that we'll probably hear about next, which is the two estates that I went to were certified by. It's something that if any of us saw it on a package or something like that, we'd say, oh, great. I mean, I trust this. It's an international body that certifies plenty of other things, operates in dozens of countries, so on and so forth. And then, of course, the IFC's involvement, which is also to say our tax money's involvement, lending its own credibility to their stake in these plantations seemed to lend credibility. But I guess the last thing that I would say is that what actually really kind of hit me the most in traveling around the plantations was the bravery of the people that spoke on the record to both myself and to Peter and Ashwini and I'm sure to other people, including the IFC's internal compliance review. Many plantation workers have faced retaliation. They've been demoted, and not just like, oh, here's a pay cut on top of what's already almost no pay, but, for instance, being given all-night shifts or being transferred to cleaning toilets instead of doing pruning of bushes, or people's families. If say a husband is retaliated against, maybe his wife, who is a temporary worker and not a permanent worker, is then denied employment in the next season. It's a very, very serious kind of life-shattering type of retaliation that happens, and the bravery that I witnessed in a lot of people was commendable, even if born out of a sense of desperation at their kind of inability to use either unions or their own organizing power to affect change on the plantations. So I worry in some ways for source safety, but I hope that there are enough eyes trained on this issue now that that it's not just these somewhat vulnerable local advocacy groups that will be there to stick up for those people who choose to speak out or try and organize some type of legal action to fight against the low wages or the poorly implemented Plantations Labor Act.
Great. Well, thank you very much.
Okay, so I'm Sarah Besky. I'm a cultural anthropologist. I work primarily on issues of labor and environment, and that's what brought me to Darjeeling to study agriculture, specifically plantation agriculture, in 2006. And so since 2006, I've been working in Darjeeling. And Darjeeling is kind of a special place. It's different than Assam, and I'm going to for a lot of reasons. Geographically, geopolitically, it's pretty. So Assam, if you're looking at a map, is in the northeast, and then there's this little country of Bhutan, and then there's this little finger of India that sticks up between Bhutan and Nepal, up towards Tibet. And that's where Darjeeling is situated. So, it's kind of stuck between Tibet and China to its north, Bhutan, Nepal, Bangladesh to its south, and kind of the rest of India. It's kind of thought of as this the chicken's neck, the gateway to kind of the northeast. And it's a mountainous region. It was formed as a hill station by the British as a mountainous, cool complement to the plains, a place where British settlers and colonial administrators could convalesce, could recuperate from the diseases that riddled the plains. And so Darjeeling formed first as this kind of recuperative, mystical, Edenic space, and some colonial officials at the time that Darjeeling is developing, the British East India Company is realizing that trade with China is not particularly sustainable, and they're looking looking to their empire, their burgeoning empire, as a place to grow tea. And they tested tea seeds there, and they happened to flourish. Darjeeling, because of its kind of hinterlandish, its remoteness from Calcutta, which was the main kind of imperial port, it was deemed a wasteland. It was deemed a wasteland because of this geographic remoteness, but also because the people who lived there were nomadic. The Lepchas were not settled agriculturalists, so the British deemed that they had no rights to the soil. And so they deemed that, so they categorized Darjeeling and all of its kind of surrounding tracts, which became tea plantations, a wasteland. In a wasteland, you don't need to buy it from local landholders. It's up for the taking. So any settler who would put some money into a piece of land, it was theirs. And so a lot of settlers started cultivating tea in Darjeeling. And Darjeeling, as a result of this kind of amalgam of mountainous, this mountainous ridge, it's kind of backset by Kanchenjunga, the third highest peak in the world, and then these sweeping hillsides of tea. This green, this verdant, this kind of just beautiful, striking landscape. But it's a beauty, right, that makes you kind of cringe, right, because you realize the kind of landscape manipulations, the kind of extraction that went on to make it, right? So that's it's beautiful, but it's disgusting, right? And so it's that landscape in which I've spent most of my time as an anthropologist. And so to do work as an anthropologist, right? So for those of you who are not familiar with anthropology, particularly cultural anthropology, what we do is kind of tersely known as deep hanging out. So I went to Darjeeling and I walked onto plantations and I started picking tea. I started drinking tea. Most of my work was either drinking it or plucking it, and going to weddings, going to funerals, doing just daily life stuff, and just starting to feel and understand life from someone else's perspective. Right? That's what we do. No matter where we do it, that's kind of the basis of it. And so I was able to get access, perhaps because plantation owners just didn't think I had anything I could possibly say. Like, what is this white girl going to say, right, about tea? I mean, she can't possibly have any idea. I speak the Pali. This enabled me to work with workers and talk with workers and to kind of understand what life was like on a plantation. And I went to Darjeeling not to study the plantation itself, but to look at what fair trade and what organic and how these kind of certification schemes were making life better for workers. That's what I wanted to do. That was my idealistic proposal project. That's what I got funded to do, and I was super excited about showing up in Darjeeling and finding this out. And the first questions that were asked of me when I got there by planters at the Darjeeling, having a whiskey on the veranda of the Darjeeling Planters Club was like, so tell me, how do we get more fair trade tea? How do we get more organic tea? How does it work? Does it work? And I'm like, those are the questions I'm supposed to be asking you. So there's even, amongst the planters who were, advocating for certification, who were participating in certification, they too were kind of, there was this kind of this kind of disconnect between what the certification meant and what it might look like in practice. And I was really discouraged at first because fair trade and organic, we'll stick with fair trade. Fair trade had so little meaning in the daily lives of workers. No matter how I translated it, no one knew what fair trade was, right? It's like, well, I was like, how about this institution that, is associated with fair trade? Have you seen that? Have you heard about fair trade premiums or these minimum wage structures or this or that? Are there loans? Nothing. Like, absolutely nothing. So I was like, okay, this is going to be a long couple of years. So I decided to, so I backed up. I backed way up. And I was like, okay. And it's really kind of only after you stay somewhere for a really long time that you actually even figure out the questions to really ask. And so my question became, what is a plantation? What is a plantation in the 21st century? How we think of plantations as this thing of the bygone era, right? This thing that doesn't exist anymore. This is, this institution associated with slavery in the U.S. South and cotton. But the plantation still exists today, and exists in different forms in different places, but it's still very much with us. And no matter, especially in the case of Fairtrade, no matter about all the attempts to euphemize it, to call it a farm, to call them farmers, to call it an estate or a garden, it's a plantation. But it means something really specific to workers. And I came to, Ashwini and Max talked about the Plantations Labor Act. And, the Plantations Labor Act for me is this great paradox, right? Is, as Ashwini and Max pointed out, is something that bonds people to land. It is something that bonds people to this to the plantation. But at the same time, it is the facilities, right? And that's the word that workers use to describe the provisions of the Plantations Labor Act that made work humane, right? So it's this institution that that's why these kind of what the Plantations Labor Act provisions, what were formerly recruitment kind of benefits, they were done to keep workers alive, to keep workers marginally healthy, so that they would keep plucking tea. At the same time, these provisions still live on today as parts of the Plantations Labor Act, and they're exactly what workers told me was so important to life on the plantation and to their daily lives, and to why, for example, in the mid 1990s, as described in the report, and earlier in Darjeeling, plantations closed. And there were no plucking jobs, and women workers in particular went to town and broke rocks and portered tourist luggage, and made pretty much the same amount of money that they would on a plantation. But when that plantation reopened as a result of perhaps international certifications or geographical indication status, which I also work on, right, which is something Darjeeling shares with Roquefort and Champagne, plantations are reopening. And women went back to work on the plantation, right? They had been emancipated, right? They had been, these entrepreneurs, but they went back to work on the plantations. And that to me was like, okay, so why? And so what kind of, so what did the plantation mean for workers? Became this kind of driving force of my research. And for workers, the plantation is a set of relationships, right? And it's not just a set of relationships, right? In this kind of old school agrarian studies, peasant studies kind of model, if you're familiar with that, between these moral economic relationships between workers and management, right? It's something more complicated than that. It's something that involves the non-human world. It's relationships between management, between owners, and between themselves and these tea bushes, and the kind of the built environment and the natural environment that constitute the plantation, right? And so it kind of made sense to me that Fairtrade just didn't even make sense in this context, because what Fairtrade is trying to do is not that kind of, it's not relational. It's a market-based strategy, right? It's and the plantation sits just outside of this free market in which Fairtrade works, right? It is this kind of, this holdover, as we talked of a feudal, of a colonial era, right? There is no free market for labor. Labor, a job is inherited. It is tied to a house, right? So another reason why these women went back to work is if they didn't go back to work, they would lose their house. So it's this interesting kind of institution that this kind of became the focus of my research, and so I mean I it's a pretty my book is a pretty scathing critique of Fairtrade, not just on plantations, but I mean as a question. As a, what is it that we do? What is it that we want to do with ourselves to buy someone else's life? Like, what is to buy someone? What are we doing when we participate in Fairtrade? And why is and how is the extension of Fairtrade as a project, as a market, as perhaps a movement? And how has it come to unequally incorporate these plantations? And on plantations, right, these hired labor standards that we've just talked about, it operates very different than on cooperatives. And during the time that I worked on plantations, kind of the key institution on a Fairtrade plantation is something called the joint body, right? And it's an institution, the Fairtrade premium is supposed to be democratically decided upon how it's distributed. And on the joint body, managers, an owner, and a representative, an elected, ideally, group of workers sit and jointly decide how to distribute those revenues, right? Put yourself in that room. and think about how jointly, right, that distribution could possibly happen, right? And so for me, and for many critics of the fair trade system, right, that joint body is just kind of doomed to failure. So that's kind of those are some of the questions that motivated the research in terms of third-party certification. And and the backdrop of all this, and it's kind of alluded to in the report as well. In West Bengal, there were Darjeeling and Darjeeling and the Doors and all of its plantations and its majority of Gorkhas or Indian Nepalis were fighting to break off a state, to break off a separate Indian state, to break the northern part of West Bengal off as a state of Gorkha land. And so for workers, I looked at these kind of contending movements for justice, right? Fairtrade being one, and Gorkha land being another kind of movement for justice. Something that made more sense to workers, right? Something that was about land in a very material sense. Something that was about kind of getting recognition. Something that's about like getting rights for workers. And I'd be happy to talk about it more, but since the context of the panel is about fair trade, I'll just kind of allude to that. And so this kind of brings me to my next project and the report and its criticisms of this kind of plantation but not quite plantation APPL format is part of larger industry-wide reforms that I'm looking at under the guise of a movement called T2030, which is a kind of this interesting marriage of fair trade and Rainforest alliance with major corporate institutions like Tata, like Hindustan Unilever, like Twinings, Finley's, every tea company you can probably think of, like major tea company, they're part of this. And they're fighting for the breakup of the plantations because labor costs are too high. They constitute what is quoted as 55 to 70% of made tea production costs, and we have as a movement we need to reduce those. So models like APPL are kind of pilot projects for that disintegration. And secondly, the second kind of node of reform is the breakup of the tea auction system. And so with the advent of tea plantations, there was a matter of a question of how to sell it. And tea was auctioned. It was auctioned in rooms. Auctioned just in rooms just like this. I, as an auctioneer, will call out lots, and y'all will bid on it. And lot by lot, that's how we went. That's how tea is auctioned. Kind of a little old school system, according to the government of India and these corporate players. So what T2030 and these private third party partnership want to do is turn that outcry system into a futures market, into something where tea can be kind of readily traded as undifferentiated, non-fat dried milk, coffee, and pig parts and whatnot, right, on this kind of free market, like to kind of standardize the commodity in such a way that it can freely circulate without these kind of barriers like auctions, like plantations. So APPL is just one part in some really, really troubling industry-wide reforms that we're seeing right now. So I'm gonna end with that.
Great, thank you. So equal exchange does not certify plantations. We're not going to hear a justification, I think, of the things that have been criticized here, but hopefully more about what fair trade can be in the view of equal exchange.
Thank you. Thanks, Peter. Is this working? So yeah, I'm Phyllis Robinson. I work with Equal Exchange. We are a fair trade organization. And I'm actually not going to defend fair trade certification of plantations. We are 100% against fair trade certification of plantations for many of the reasons that people before me have talked about. Certainly the joint bodies are a sham. We don't believe that it is the way to achieve workers' rights or better conditions, working conditions for folks on the plantations. So I'm going to park that for a minute. I want to just tell you a little bit about who Equal Exchange is so you can understand the context that I'm working in, and then talk about, actually I'm not going to talk about tea, I'd like to talk about coffee as a model that I believe fair trade has worked and continues to work for millions of farmers around the world. So, and then I'll end there. But just a question, how many people buy or drink Fairtrade coffee? Okay, and Fairtrade tea, if you're still willing to admit that. Okay. So there is a big difference, as you can imagine. So the mission of equal exchange, which does fall within the Fairtrade mission, I would say, is primarily Fairtrade got started to try to change the way that trade is done. And I'm going to say that equal exchange, our primary mission, is to do that by building alternative supply chains from small farmers with as few middle people as possible to consumers. And I think, as Sarah has said, it's a market-based tool, but it's really a hybrid. It's working within a market to accomplish social justice issues. And because of that, there are inherent contradictions. I think it does some things very, very well, and other things not so well. But, so I'll tell you a little bit more now. But Equal Exchange, we were founded in 1986. We were the first fair trade organization in the United States to work with food. And it was created by 3 young guys in their 20s who came out of the food co-op movement in the Northeast. And they saw that in the 80s that consumers were dangerously disconnected from their food sources. People had no idea where their food came from. And I'm talking about local food at this point, certainly not food that was grown internationally. Had no idea how it was grown, who grew it, and what conditions the growers were working under. And so they decided to create a company. They thought for a while about making this a nonprofit because they really had a social justice education idea behind it. But they decided if their goal was to try to change the way trade is done, then they needed to create a business and show that business could be done in a different way, that it doesn't have to be guided by profit only. And so they created a worker-owned cooperative. They were very interested in the food co-op. Well, the co-op movement that they worked in was owned by consumers, but the workers had no say. And so they decided this would be a worker co-op, and it would work with organizations that were democratically structured. And they looked to Europe at the time because in the U.S., as I said, there was no fair trade movement, but there was a movement in Europe. And it was sort of on its second wave. The first wave of fair trade in Europe was created really after World War II as a solidarity model, an NGO and religious organization-based model to help Eastern European refugees who needed to have livelihoods after their lives were destroyed in the war. The second wave of fair trade in Europe was groups of people who were looking at nationalist movements and land reform movements and environmental and worker rights movements across the world and saying, what do we do to be in solidarity with these, with folks in these countries, with farmers? What can we do? And so they said they need access to markets. So you've got people who are, Sandinistas in Nicaragua. You've got people who are starting to create alternative systems in their countries. How do we in the North support them? And that's pretty much how the concept of alternative trade got started. It was different from a charity model. It was not an NGO-based poverty alleviation model. It was more, we're going to use trade, which exists, and try to do it differently. And in the process, try to build these alternative supply chains. So in the North, the goal was to educate consumers to use fair trade. I mean, everybody buys, everybody shops. So rather than ask for donations to support a social cause, which an NGO would do, it said, put your money where your values are, buy products, use this as a tool to talk about social justice, to talk about conditions of farmers, and to talk about where food comes from. And so it was designed to educate consumers about the food system and about the trade system. That's in the North. From the groups that we were buying from in the South, the goal was market access. And I think that is probably the most important thing to say, because when we're comparing plantations and small farmer models, if the goal is so if you think about what small farmer groups are coming up against, to try to compete with plantations, which are typically owned by one owner or by a multinational company, how is a group of small farmers who are living in remote areas, who have very little, if any, access to market information, to technology, to loans from banks, to infrastructure, going to compete with an existing system which is already designed, vertically integrated? You've got Chiquita and Dole in the banana world. So really it was market access, to pay a higher price, to have direct long-term relationships, and it is relational, very much so, and to provide credit where no bank is going to give credit. And so that was the beginning of fair trade. And as people have alluded to, in the mid-90s in Europe, there was different countries had different certification bodies being created. And there was a split between the countries that had certifying bodies that said, absolutely, this is a small farmer model, and the ones who said, let's extend the fair trade model into plantations. That group sort of won out, and when Flow International, the international certifying body, was created, plantations were allowed into the fair trade system in certain products like tea and bananas. Coffee, to date, it has not been allowed in there. So I just want to really, really briefly talk about what life is like for small coffee farmers. I'm going to talk about Latin America, but we work in Asia and Africa as well. But just to give you an example, so I'm sort of parking the question about workers' rights on plantations because that is outside of what equal exchange does. So just to talk about the work that we do for a minute, as you know, I'm sure, many of the civil wars in Central America and elsewhere were partly due to conditions on coffee plantations and other plantations as well. But in El Salvador in the 30s, there was a massacre that took place over a week, and 30,000 indigenous Salvadorans were killed for asking for better conditions on coffee plantations. And the history, at least in, I'll say Latin America, has been that indigenous people were thrown off the land. The land was given by governments to people, many of European, not even descent, many Europeans, to create the coffee export model for the country. They were given every tax benefit and infrastructure improvements. And the indigenous who were thrown off the land in many of these countries, they had they created laws that said, vagabond laws, that said if you were sitting somewhere, in a park, not working, you would either be thrown in jail or you would have to go work on a plantation. And so in that way, many folks who used to live and work on their own land had to go back and become workers on, let's say, coffee plantations. And so we work right now with farmers. I should say when Equal Exchange got started in '86, our first product was Cafe Nica, which we were able to buy through a loophole in the embargo that Reagan was president and Sandinistas were in power in Nicaragua, and you were not allowed to buy products from Nicaragua. So that was our first product. 30 years later, we're now working in coffee, tea, bananas, nuts, dried fruit, all from small farmers in something like 20 countries, and we work with 40-odd small farmer organizations. So anyway, so when we visit, which we do quite often, we're told, and this story that I'm going to tell you takes place in Chiapas, but it's really the story of many, if not most, of the groups we work with. And so farmers that we visit, they and their parents were really on plantations in the same, more or less, a parallel situation to what we're hearing about India today. And there were disappearances and death squads, and people talked about their wives, being just property for the landowner or the foreman. There was nothing that anybody could do. The same thing where instead of wages, they were paid through goods at the company store, which were 5 times higher than the going rate. And through one, in every country, in every situation, it was different. But as land reform began to happen in different places, mainly through struggle, farmers were able to get the plantation owners to leave to sell the land to the farmers. Long story we can't get into. But what happened in this case in Chiapas is that the previous landowners were pretty much forced to leave these plantations, and the indigenous folks were able to have to pay, but they got the land back. The large landowners then went into the cities and became worked for multinational coffee companies. So now you have farmers in the mountains who, great, they've got land again and they've got coffee, but what are they going to do with this coffee? So they have to sell it back to the original owner, who, when they go with their coffee, has the scales. The scales are cheating the farmers. They're getting paid a price. They're being told what the going price is in New York, and it's not, of course, the price that is the actual price. And so one more time, they're pretty much, they've gotten one step forward, but they're still nowhere. And so they start to form organizations, cooperatives, and this is also a long story how that happens. But the point is that these are folks who have gone from working on a plantation in very unjust situations to owning small, we're talking very small plots of land, banding together for some sort of power, economic power, and then they have no market. And so the fair trade system was created to say, okay, we're going to work with you, we're going to pay you the fairest price we can, and we can talk about that as well. But the price is really a very, very small piece, I think, of what the fair trade model is about. And so, once again, it is about connecting producers and consumers. It is trying to find a way to engage North Americans and Europeans in what is going on in other countries. And then through the system that gets created, and I actually think that the credit that is extended so that farmers can live during the year before the coffee is harvested is one of the most important things. But after that and beyond that, it's the fact that small farmers, where they before were, basically slaves, and then just independent farmers with no ability to reach a market, are now organized, and because they're organized, they can do many other things that have nothing to do with selling an export crop to the United States. The things that they can accomplish because they're organized are, all sorts of programs and projects of their own creation. They've got networks now of interested people who, when there's an emergency, care about what just happened to them. They're setting prices instead of being told the going price is this. They're now saying, you know what, actually, we don't want to sell to you. I can list the cases of groups that have told Starbucks, sorry, we don't like your terms anymore. We happen to know that we can get a better price over here. They're now going to trade shows and doing tours all over, other countries, both the North and the South. They're in many cases, they've gotten elected, they've gotten people elected to Senate. We have a vice president in Peru who was basically, I'm going to say, put on the slate by a group of coffee farmers in northern Peru, and she is now an advocate for small farmer policies in the country. So anyway, it's a long, I'm getting the signal. Pretty much that's what I'll tell you about coffee. And I just want to say, I'll end, but to say that it really was accomplished not because Starbucks or Green Mountain or Lipton or Tetley said, hey, let's help small farmers. It's really hard work. It takes tremendous risk. It involves both on the small farmers' part and the traders in the US and Europe. And it's a system that is painfully created. Now to have a certifier say, hey, that's great. Let's just label this fair trade. Let's apply that model and say, we can help workers on the plantation because people are going to buy Lipton tea is not, we don't think, the case. But I'll stop there.
Well, thank you very much to all the panelists. I think we take this in many different directions. There's a lot of expertise on the panel, and we had one taste there at the end of one of the perhaps the the most admirable of systems to try to incorporate social responsibility into sector and into trade. And as Max has mentioned, and as Ashwini alluded to, others have come into play in the tea sector in India, including the work that went into this Columbia Law School report, where the tea plantations were certified by Social Accountability International, a New York-based organization, and also with the support of the World Bank and its performance standards. So there's a whole slew of different social responsibility standards that have come into play. Let's open up and see what kinds of questions you have. Yeah.
Okay, I have 3 questions.
Okay, introduce yourself.
My name is Kathleen Karen, and so I have a question for Phyllis. When you're talking about when you're talking about the small coffee plantation, are there any laborers involved, any workers involved, or are these really just families and their children working their own farms? And if they do have laborers, any kind of standards there? Then I had a question for you. I didn't understand what the consequence is of ending the tea auction. It sounded like it wasn't a good idea, but I didn't understand why it wasn't a good idea, so you can elaborate that. And Ashwini, when you talked about the World Bank, the new model of the workers owning it, so what happens after 7 years? Supposedly they paid it off, they own the plantation. Is there any benefit at all, or where do the workers end up after 7 years?
Okay, so just very quickly, so the coffee farmers are small farmers. They have not much land. Coffee is a family crop, and so in some cases it is pretty much just the family that works there. In some cases, again, depending on the size of the farm, during the harvest, which happens, could be over a 3-week period, they need to hire help. Sometimes that's done in a community. People work with each other. We're talking about all over the world. Sometimes it is done by migrants in the border of Guatemala and Mexico. For example, the Guatemalans come over and work on the Mexican farms. So there's a whole range of situations, but it's generally a very time, it's during the harvest when there will be workers. Fairtrade has it's basically says you can't pay them less than the minimum wage of the country. I don't know if there's even any other, I don't know if Fairtrade has other stipulations in the small farmers part for workers, but it's pretty much what the country's minimum wage is.
Sure. So the auction, there's a lot. I mean, if and when it goes away, there's a lot at play. First, there's this idea. So each teas are graded. They have super fine, tippy, golden, flowery, orange, pico 1 is a grade of tea, and that acronym is supposed to speak for itself in this kind of futures market. So at present, each and every buyer gets a sample of tea, and they taste it and they buy it based on the actual taste of tea. And lots are auctioned in a sequential way, right? And the plantation order always comes up the same way, so you know what you're buying. In this online system, and then as it's transitioned to a futures market, the online system, which is what I've studied, lots come up randomly, so you kind of don't know what's coming up next, and they're trying to not send out samples. The government thinks it's a waste of tea to send out these samples of tea, so these acronyms that are given by plantations are supposed to kind of, again, the plantation name with the date of manufacture, because tea is unlike coffee. It's not harvested in one kind of fell swoop. It's done every day. A section of tea, a section up here versus a section down here. Those kind of constitute, in a way, different vintages, right? In which coffee is 1 year, 1 harvest. Tea is a lot more complicated. So that crazy variability is reduced to these kind of these kind of letters and numbers that are supposed to speak for themselves, and that's so there's this idea that the actual taste of tea, the quality of tea, will change. Certainly, at stake are the jobs of hundreds and hundreds of auctioneers and buyers who are going to be forced out of the system. And just kind of I think just the taste thing is kind of my entry point as an anthropologist into kind of telling the story. That kind kind of gets people up in arms, like, wait a minute, the actual taste of tea could change because of the reforms in the system. So
is the tea auction specific to India? What happens with
Oh.
tea that comes from Kenya, Malawi,
it's auctioned there
Sri
as well.
Lanka, and similarly in lots, so
Yes.
that gradation.
So the tea auction in Mombasa, the tea auction in Calcutta, and all of now it's there's regional auction, tons of regional auction centers, and the Sri Lankan tea auction in Colombo for 150 years operated exactly the same in each and every place. The same vocabulary was used in each and every tea auction to describe the same qualities of tea, even though they're produced in different places.
And when you talk about the cost, that's 55% that's labor, does that count the transaction costs in the tea auction?
It doesn't.
It doesn't.
No. That's the social costs, the PLA costs.
Mhm.
That's some percentage that industry people are using to say what those main tea production costs are and how much of it is labor, how much of it is the payment of the PLA, right? Because it's important to note that the wage for tea workers is kept artificially low because of this, because of the PLA. Because of the non-monetary forms of compensation they get. So like in this elaborate capitalist mathematics, right, the actual monetary wage plus all of this PLA stuff equals their real wage, and their real wage is, and you can hear it quoted as $20, $30 a day, or, depending on which planter you talk to.
Okay, so over the next 7 years, workers will see this deduction in order to pay for the shares that they've bought. For the first 4 of those years, the workers were guaranteed a certain dividend of 6%. After that, they're after the end of the 4 years and then into the future, it's whatever the declared dividend is, that's what they get. 6% is, according to people we've talked to, considered high. 6% is less than what those workers would have received if they had put those 8,000 rupees, the $150, into a fixed deposit at the beginning of the 8-year period. So, given what the economics of growing tea are at the moment, no one expects that those workers are going to get rich from having invested in those shares. In fact, it's fair to assume that they're not going to do very well. They're non-voting shares. The Tata retains a 40% interest in this company, APPL. There were a few other large investors. So the workers who are bearing a substantial part of the risk don't get to have any kind of collective voice in the operation of the company, even though that they own whatever percentage it may be. Nor does the IFC, which is the IFC doesn't vote its shares either.
In the back.
Is there a
And could you introduce yourself?
Hi, I'm David Benjamin from Rutgers University. Is there a campaign and a strategy of which consumers, international Beacon federations, researchers, and social justice committees, church parishes are trying to wrest control of the Fairtrade certification away from the multinational companies?
So the question is whether there's an international campaign to wrest control of fair trade away from the multinationals.
I don't think I can quite answer that question, but I can say that on a very small scale, Equal Exchange has tried to let consumers know that there is a difference between fair trade, small farmer fair trade, plantation fair trade, and that we believe that not only is a plantation tea and banana fair trade not doing what it says it's doing, but it is actually both preventing the creation of an alternative supply chain and possibly harming workers or creating a worse situation for workers, and also duping consumers into thinking when they reach for a box of certified fair trade tea that they're doing good. So we've tried to, there's a booklet in the back there about the history of authentic fair trade, It's a little bit difficult for a company to do a campaign like that because it appears self-serving, and so we're in this sort of odd predicament of believing, what we are doing, but we can't say. So when you ask the question, well, what do? We'll buy our tea. I mean, I can say that, and our tea is from small farmers, but that's certainly not what we are genuinely concerned about the certificate. We've taken the Fairtrade certification off of our boxes of tea because we want nothing to do with the certifier. That we don't tend to use a certifier for most things. But that doesn't truly answer your question, but just from our perspective.
Yeah.
I'm Andrea. I'm from SEPA. What has fundamentally changed with the original mission of Fairtrade? I'm assuming that certification programs like Flow and other fair trade organizations had a positive vision, and I'm wondering, was there something that's changed along the way? Did multinationals get more power as it became bigger? What is the cause of this problem? Why are they accepting plantations that are clearly doing this bad?
I know you have a real answer, I'm sure. I just want to recount an anecdote of our own, because we undertook this research in good faith, hoping really that we were going to see something positive on fair trade plantations that might serve as a model for other plantations. And we were pretty shocked by how nothing was different. I remember meeting Sarah early on in Darjeeling, and I think the message that she conveyed was really, there's no reason to believe your fair trade tea plantation is any better than others. In fact, there are others that I know to be better. And that reality was really pretty bracing, because the rhetoric of these plantations was just out of control in terms of the claims that these new fair trade, not even so new fair trade plantations were making. And when we got to the fair trade, offices in Bonn to discuss this with them, we sat down for the first time with the funder of the project, who was from the Friedrich Ebert Stiftung, and he said, "Oh yeah, I knew that all along. Nothing you're saying surprises me at all. I was against this from the start." And so clearly there were voices all along that knew that it was a fool's errand to go off and to certify plantations, and the absurdity that they didn't confront this wage structure, for example, where everybody's paid exactly the same wage on every plantation for whatever they do. There's no paying someone more. There's no possibility of a living wage, which is a core element of the fair trade standards. And so they went ahead and implemented something with this sort of absurd disconnect. And all we could say was that the brand mentality of fair trade had so taken over. It was so important to them to now nurture this and not to let it be harmed, that eventually they quashed our research. They couldn't let the story come out, because that would muddle, even though in the room in Bonn, they didn't deny anything that we said or that we showed. So the mentality of a brand becoming the mentality of fair trade, of that label that Phyllis referred to as having taken off their goods, that's what we felt and experienced.
And there's something, to think about the concept of consumer-driven social justice. Consumers want more fair trade, and they don't want to pay a lot of money for it. There's structural forces at play too.
And I guess I just want to add to that too. We work with two Rooibos associations in South Africa, and they're the only two indigenous South African organizations of Rooibos in the fair trade system. The rest of the Rooibos comes from white-owned plantations in South Africa. There's a lot of tension between them because, again, that's who these small farmer groups have to compete with. And I was at a meeting in somewhere in Africa once where the head of the Wuppertal Association said, what apartheid did not accomplish for small farmers in all those years, the fair trade certifiers will. And I think that there are certainly good people working for the certification system, and there are certainly people who genuinely are trying to figure out how to address worker rights and think that this model can be applied to plantations. So I don't want to be overly critical of everybody that works there, but I'm going to agree that it has become a brand, that there is a drive to have everything in a store certified fair trade, regardless of the fact of whether it actually has any meaning or any impact. And also just to say that there is money involved, and when a corporation, a multinational, says, "Oh, well, now people are starting to recognize fair trade, and we need to have one brand of a fair trade product. Get it for us, and here's the money." Just again, market access is the thing, and the plantation owner doesn't need that market access, so it's just the wrong tool. But they don't know that.
There were 2 points, but one, Max mentioned this issue of temporary workers and permanent workers, and I sort of thought all of these plantation workers were permanent, if they sort of indentured. And I wanted to know how that happened. And then I think you mentioned something about some cases that might be challenging these, whether or not the Plantation Labor Act actually does conform to international or even minimum wage standards. Can you talk about this?
Sure. I'm not entirely sure what the history is behind the divide between permanent and temporary, but there are only so many workers that a plantation needs, and that also fluctuates seasonally. But I guess my more sinister interpretation of it is that temporary workers are not entitled to the same benefits under the Plantations Labor Act that permanent workers are, and often temporary workers will be employed 11 out of 12 months in a year, but still not receive those same benefits that somebody who's permanently employed by the plantation does.
Do they get lower wages compared to the?
No, they get the same wage, but the populations also grow on these plantations, but the need for work doesn't, and so there are more and more temporary workers, and that has resulted in situations, for instance, where each family is allotted a house, but if you have a bunch of temporary workers and entire families of temporary workers, they all move in, and you have 3 or 4 families living under one roof, situations like that. And I just wanted to say, it's not really related to your question, but I think what follows from that is, well, why don't temporary workers go do something else, right? I mean, are there not other things? Couldn't they just be a regular poor person outside the plantation? And one, I think, just generally in that region, there aren't that many jobs, and there's not much land. You couldn't just go and get land, and you couldn't do those things. And then there's also, in 1996, and there have been spells of it afterwards, there have been kind of waves of ethnic cleansing, actually, against the populations that most tea workers come from. And so I think there's a lot of kind of internalized fear of really integrating into like Assamese society outside of that.
The cases.
Oh, and then the cases. Well, I'm actually not that familiar with them, but some of them have risen as high as the Supreme Court in Delhi. And they are essentially challenging the fact that the PLA is not being implemented, but they're taking a more piecemeal approach. For instance, wages will end up being one. There will be a particular thing about these wages are below minimum wage, and the collusion of management and the unions is unconstitutional. So that would be the argument. And then there are other cases, I think, that have to do with the shareholding, the worker shareholding thing. Maybe not. I'm not sure you could speak to that.
No, I mean, there's been challenges contemplated to the breakup of plantations. But the other big case that got to the Supreme Court that came from the tea plantation community was the right to food, where in the early 2000s there were just massive starvation deaths across many plantations. I mean, thousands of workers died when planters basically just decided they couldn't operate the plantations anymore. They left. They stopped paying the water bill. Water was turned off. People were reduced to drinking from drains. I mean, it was devastating. So that case resulted in state governments being forced to pay monthly stipends to workers on these closed plantations.
There's one other thing that I wanted to add, which is that a lot of the workers that I spoke to, the greatest fear that they expressed was not retaliation from management. It was that all this kind of meddling, so to speak, from the outside, whether it's IFC's internal review or us or something like that, might result in the plantations closing. And that was by far the worst scenario. And so I think in terms of looking for solutions, like hitting Tata hard and hitting their bottom line and stuff like that might well have the worst possible effect in the eyes of the people who work on the plantation. So there's definitely a need for more vigorous oversight and I mean even internal oversight in the bodies that issue certifications. But there's also, I mean, you also just hope for the more structural factors like the tea market and prices of tea to keep going up and stuff like that too, so that these plantations can keep surviving.
Yeah.
Yeah. Hi, I'm Ezra Rashko. I'm an environmental historian. I mostly work on Adivasi issues in central India, conservation, to some extent development and displacement. And so my first question was for Ashwini Supanka. I was a little bit taken aback, because I'm a historian, by this idea that there was no change in the last 150 years, right? And I think especially coming out in these questions and answers, we have a lot of issues, especially with Gandh and other Adivasi communities coming in as you described some of these issues in your last response to that. But I guess I was just wondering if you could elaborate more on the sort of development of these issues since the Labor Act and everything in the midterms.
Well, I mean, to begin with, it was somewhat hyperbole, but
Of course, absolutely.
But when the Plantation Labor Act was framed in 1960, it was precisely because of the fear of change, right? So in order to preserve stability, it had to enshrine, to kind of preserve in amber what was both the best and the worst of colonial practice. So when practice became statute, a lot of what might have changed was really was stalled. I mean, there are many other things that could be pointed to. So, for example, in Assam, at the point of not long after independence, when there really might have been the possibility for independent unions, the Congress Party basically sent one of their people around plantation by plantation to each owner and said, please, with a letter that said to each plantation owner, please cooperate with this guy. He's going to set up one of our unions in your plantation. Give him every cooperation, and everything will be fine. I don't want to naturalize what I describe as a lack of change. It's been very, very deliberate and very political.
And you might say something about the Adivasi identity
Oh.
and how that's changed. I mean, certainly. Or
Well,
not.
that's a bigger story. I mean, you must be familiar with the Tea tribe identity as it's emerged on the plantations and the attempts to make political assertions, but it hasn't necessarily meant any changes in the labor lines of the plantations.
I think one thing that is striking, and obviously it varies in different regions. We were talking about that earlier, is the eeriness of what looks like it hasn't changed, which is all the workers are Adivasi up to a particular level. There are a few who have made it into these showcase positions of welfare officers, where they perform a management-like role, which is primarily the role of telling their fellow Adivasis that they can't repair their house, they won't repair their water, and get back to work and quit faking your sickness. So this language, the language difference and ethnic difference, that's stratification of the plantations is quite fascinating and quite dramatic. And one of these moments that was so, for us, kind of brought it home is we're sitting with the management who are the high-level management. They're maybe Punjabi, they're elsewhere, their English is elegant, their children have gone to school with ours, their nephews are on Wall Street, and they're talking about the difficulty of life there, and they're sitting in their beautiful homes and talking about how hard it was to raise their children, and they say, it was so hard because there were no other children. Ignoring the 3,000 workers all around them and all of their children who are the Adivasis, or the next level up, the Babus, who are Bengali speaking, or others. So each so clearly stratified and differentiated in roles that they've had, with only the brown faces replacing the whites at the top. Yeah.
My name is Rebecca Schleifer, and I was really taken by your comment about what the workers want. Kathleen and I both lived and worked in rural South Florida a couple of years after they ended the sugar program, which employed tens of thousands of Jamaican and East workers from the West Indies. And as much as the program was horrible and our office litigated against it, when you go to Jamaica, one of the first things people say is, "I wish we still had jobs in Florida." So in that light, I'm wondering, I really want to hear from any of you about, first of all, I wanted to ask what the World Bank's response to this was, especially given their so-called process of changing right now. And what are your recommendations in that light?
Well, I'll say about our report, it's interesting, Max, I'd love to now know what the APPL response to the New York Times was. APPL's response to us is online along with the World Bank reply, so it's all on the Columbia website. APPL denounced the report, claimed that we'd engaged in defamation, didn't have the specifics but would get back to us with more of them, had some ideas. And frankly, just to be completely honest, I think Columbia people were starting to get a little bit nervous at that point. It's very, there are fewer and fewer reports about companies because the threats of defamation are so profound. And a lot of the newspapers, Financial Times and others will avoid. But the good news for us was that the response from the World Bank came the next day. And the response from the World Bank was, "Thank you so much for this report." And that caught us a bit by surprise because they had asked us to remove names and we refused. But on the other hand, the process of the complaints process inside the World Bank had already begun. And just after our report was issued, they announced their full-scale investigation. And obviously everyone knew this was coming, and the IFC was on its best behavior. So they're just as much in denial about the facts. The rest of what they have after saying thank you very much is pablum. But they decided to take the high road in terms of engagement. And I think that came from the fact that it was Columbia involved, that we had worked with groups like Padra, others, that there was a process of complaint that was already underway, and also that the U.S. we had early on in our research process alerted people in the Treasury Department who oversee the U.S. Director of the World Bank, so they knew the U.S. government was at least keeping an eye on what was there.
I can't say our recommendations got to the heart of the problem. I mean, our recommendations were pretty minor, saying things like the share sale should be converted to a shared grant, just given how low wages are. We recommended that that they have to be voting shares. There has to be worker representation on the board. But I mean, more people who've been far more engaged in the labor movement and the tea sector in India have engaged in failed experiments and the recommendations that have gone pretty much nowhere. So we were ultimately glad that we kept it minor and didn't try for big picture suggestions.
Maybe just another thing on a different kind of scale of recommendation. For me as an anthropologist, it's kind of sitting with those paradoxes, those things that we don't really, that we're uncomfortable with, and not kind of writing those things off as false consciousness, like they just don't understand how exploited they are. No, to really take those things seriously. So to take seriously what work means. To take seriously, in the case of where I work in Darjeeling, right, this critique that the colonists were less severe than what we have now, and to really kind of be like, what kind of a cultural critique is that? And to take seriously the fact that workers on plantations aren't trying to be small farmers; they want to be plantation workers. They want to work on a plantation that treats them well. To kind of sit with that and take what workers say as seriously and seriously.
I really appreciate all of your answers. I'm just saying it's interesting to talk about these things in a room full of lawyers, because with lawyers you're given fewer tools, right? Mm-hmm. So it's really great to have an interdisciplinary panel like this. It allows us to reflect a little bit more on the tool that we have.
Max, did you want to add something?
No.
Can I just throw out, one of the people that we interview and highlight in this report is a man named Virginius Kaka, who grew up on a plantation and is probably one of the most prominent academics in India who's worked on Adivasis and on plantation labor. And he starts by saying how awful it is that the Plantation Labor Act is not enforced. The housing isn't sufficient, the healthcare is terrible, 60 years into this law, and this is a community of people who live on the margins, illiterate and defecating outside. And then when he's finished with that, he says, and the whole system should be gotten rid of, because even if it worked perfectly, it would be paternalistically holding people in their place. The only reason I got out was because my parents had land. They found a way, I got out. So balancing that paradox is there, we share. Yeah.
Anton Shevich, I'm just 1L here. I'm wondering, how do we reconcile on the one hand the voice that people just want better working conditions, and on the other that if they can get out, then they get out? It seems that they want to get out if they can, and if they can't, then they say give us better conditions.
I would say those two are necessary. They're necessary for each other. The only way one of the only ways to have better working conditions is to be able to vote with your feet and lead, and then the other is to be able to join with others and vote collectively.
And my experience is that it's often the children of workers who were educated and had to leave because there were no jobs in the plantation for them. They went to Delhi, they went to Calcutta, they went somewhere else. They had to go. That they come back on holidays and they critique. They write letters. They get themselves thrown off the plantation. They get called outsiders by critiquing the conditions of the plantation, because it's not their mother that can do it at all. So there's a dialectic there.
Yes.
So most of you know, I'm Rodney, and I'm also from Equal Exchange. So we've heard why certifiers really aren't effective agents for change, and they may even make it worse by creating the appearance of change. What I think I've been hearing and reading is that the Indian state is that we shouldn't hold our breath for the Indian state to make a difference. It seems there's either some corruption or chronic neglect. It sounds like the vast majority of Indians aren't even aware, let alone care, about these workers. We've heard that it sounds like some of the unions, or most of the unions, have been bought off. I'm wondering, I'm I'm wondering is our best bet on behalf of the workers, or is the workers' best bet, in fact, with the unions, do you think that there is any chance that like a real legitimate union that was accountable, run by the workers and not co-opted, could that emerge such that workers actually had leverage to really negotiate on their behalf?
I mean, on the eastern part of the state where Darjeeling is, there've been movements toward an independent workers movement rooted in Adivasi identity. It was originally called the Progressive Tea Workers Union. It's currently formed a loose alliance with the labor part of the Gorkha liberation struggle, the Gorkha Janmukti Morcha. And they've been, as part of their key demand has been wages that are approximately 4 times higher than the current wages that are paid on plantations. It's way too early to be able to tell where that experiment will go. But for the moment, it's more than we've seen in the tea sector since for many years.
I would just like to second that. I mean, the Gorkha Janmukti Morcha labor union, for all of its problems, for all of its corruption, was able to raise the wage from 68 rupees to 90 rupees in one. Wages are negotiated on these 3-year cycles. That's really huge. And it was because, I mean, in the case of Darjeeling, which is not like Assam where there is one labor union that really kind of controls everything. Darjeeling saw that for about 22 years. There was one party and one labor union with minor labor unions, but those minor labor unions still couldn't control individual plantations, and so there was one dominant union, but there was multi-party union politics, right? So it's not like what we experience here in the States, where there's the teachers union, the pipe fitters union. Each political party has a tea union, right? And it's a dialogue between those different kinds of unions that can be productive of kinds of social change.
My experience on one of the plantations was, there's the main union, which is ACMS, and they are generally Congress affiliated and not very effective, colluding with the management and so on. But I met representatives from the CIT, which is the Communist Party's union as well. And I guess my interactions with them and then talking to other workers who felt skeptical about them made me a bit skeptical of how easily bought off union leadership can be, even if they have the best intentions. The son of the union leader will be given contracts to build new, to pave a new road or to build water pipes or something like that, and through that process, which is kind of informal corruption and benefits, they're rendered ineffective when they are, they can't then go to the management and say, make these changes, because the management will say, well, then there goes your livelihood. But I actually have a little bit more faith in the Indian state to do something. I think that there's one major thing that has been floating around that is a possibility, which is affording scheduled tribe status to tea plantation workers, which hasn't happened in many places. And scheduled tribe status is part of a larger system known as reservations in India, where if you belong to a certain caste or a certain tribe or any kind of marginalized group, there are reservations in schools and jobs, especially government jobs, for you. And those would provide real ways for people to get off the plantation and do something else. But the kind of socio-political landscape in Assam right now is very fragile. One, because there are a number of separatist movements like we've been talking about, and actually a lot of those separatist movements are led by other tribal groups that have ST, scheduled tribe status, and they oppose very vehemently the designation of so-called Cree tribes as scheduled tribes, is obviously that would dilute their power within Assam. But that said, the Congress Party is in power in Assam, and the Congress Party derives a huge number of votes, and through the union, money and power from Tea tribes, and so I think there is a glimmer of hope that they would be afforded ST status at some point in the near future.
So I think we should probably wrap up this public part, and I think many of us have time to stick around and chat if people have a few other questions or want to talk about the work in more detail. But let me thank the panelists and thank Columbia and say this is a wonderful way for us to bring to at least a partial conclusion these 3 years of engagement on tea plantations and labor.